So how did McLaren do it, and why hasn't anyone matched it since? The answer is surprisingly simple. They gave a small but stellar team the resources to do a completely clean sheet design. The origin of the car is easy to pinpoint. In September of 1988, McLaren was in the midst of trouncing everyone else in Formula 1, and 4 key men were waiting for a delayed flight at the airport in Milan on the way back from the Italian Grand Prix. 2 of McLaren's directors, their technical director, and the head of marketing. As they discussed the future of McLaren, they agreed that a road car was the way to go. The engine was tuned so that torque climbs continuously to a lofty 5,600 RPM, but the motor is far from peaky. At 1,500 RPM, it supplies more than 80% of its peak torque. In short, the engine is a monster. It has an animalistic urgency, but only when you ask for it. Just puttering around is perfectly civilized and tractable. But slam the throttle open at any speed in any gear and the car just explodes forward. One period road test described the car as uncomfortably fast, like the physical sensations of acceleration caused discomfort. I can confirm this. The duality of the powertrain is echoed in almost every system in the car, especially the chassis. The car is softly sprung, and the relatively small 17-inch wheels mean a lot of sidewall to absorb impacts, and so it rides beautifully, yet there is also incredible control. McLaren achieved this, as usual, through exceptional cleverness. Being race car folks, they knew nothing about suspension compliance, so they closely analyzed a Honda NSX, a Porsche 928, and a Jaguar XJ6. They then promptly discarded most of what everyone else was doing because compliance in suspension leads to unintended geometry changes that adversely affect handling. So in the F1, the compliant bits which isolate occupants from harshness aren't in the suspension at all. They're between the subframes that the suspension hangs on and the car's chassis. This gives race car level of control over wheel geometry changes while still isolating occupants from harshness. It's a simple but ingenious solution that gives the F1 its lovely ride but also world-beating handling. And the entire car is like this, and that's what makes it so magical. It's fast as hell but docile in town. It generates substantial downforce but very little drag. Its handling is spectacular but it rides well. It feels special and exciting, but you can drive it comfortably all day. It holds a lot of people and luggage, but is smaller and lighter than a new Porsche Boxster. The F1 is a study in having your cake and eating it too. Imagine the most delicious, decadent dessert and finding out that it gives you a six-pack and is good for your cardiovascular system. That's the F1. And there are entire systems of the car we haven't even touched on. The engine is mounted longitudinally, but the transmission is somehow transverse to keep the weight inside the wheelbase and keep the overall length of the car as short as possible. The stereo was developed specially by Kenwood and weighs half of what a conventional system does and was tested to 1.5 G. The air conditioning system was also developed from the ground up for this car and weighs half that of a conventional system. Every single window is equipped with defrosting ability thanks to a special plasma coating and a centralized DC-DC converter that McLaren developed themselves from scratch to power it. For the defroster, in essence, they considered every pain point from automobiling and used their F1 championship-winning brainpower to solve the problem in an open checkbook manner. And then they sold it to the public. Speaking of selling the car, that process was also thoroughly unconventional and quite special. The car was highly personalizable. At one point, the director of production spent an entire weekend going to grocery stores looking for the perfect eggplant in order to match its color at the request of a customer. Each car came with a nitride-coated toolkit, a Tag Heuer watch, full-fitted luggage set including golf bag, first aid kit, car cover, battery charger, detailing kit in a case numbered to match the car's serial number, and a tool cart filled with tools to keep at home. Who would need an entire cart of tools? Obviously, that would be the flying mechanics who travel from McLaren to meet the cars wherever they are in the world whenever they need maintenance. And even today, more than 25 years on, they still do this. McLaren supports the car like no other old car. The tooling to make the components still exists, and technicians will make the parts if you need them, sometimes the same technicians who built the cars new. If all that wasn't enough to convince prospective customers to buy an F1, don't worry, they had other ways. Their marketing manager was one Jonathan Palmer, who in addition to playing an active role in the development of the car and testing it to 231 miles an hour at the Nardo track in Italy, is also a Formula 1 racer. His job was to demonstrate the performance of the F1 on track to would-be buyers, one of whom pointedly observed after a test ride, "If he believes the way to sell me a car is to scare me witless and make me feel sick, he's got another thing coming." That customer subsequently bought an F1. Although the F1 famously set a record for being the world's fastest production car by an 18-mile-an-hour margin, a figure later revised by a further 9 miles an hour to 240.1 miles an hour a few years later after removing the rev limiter, this kind of specific performance target was not part of the original vision for the car. Gordon Murray's 1988 product definition document simply says, 200 miles an hour plus and 0 to 60 quickest available. In much the same way, the car was never intended to go racing, but it did, and in typical McLaren F1 fashion did so in spectacular fashion, winning Le Mans outright on its first outing as a lightly modified road car against a field of purpose-built racing prototypes. Like the rest of the F1's resume, that achievement is so extraordinary that it defies belief. How could one little car be capable of so much? The answer is that it is a car with incredible density. Not actual density, it only weighs 2,500 pounds, but density of thought. F1 owner Rowan Atkinson said, "It's not just the quality of construction, but quality of thinking that owners admire." That thoughtfulness never ceases to amaze. The more you look and learn, the more impressive the car is. It feels almost as if it violates the laws of nature because it has so few compromises, such dazzling clarity of purpose. Yet for all its cleverness, the best part of the car is the experience it provides, and that's a reflection of Gordon Murray's philosophy. The extraordinary talent of the F1 team could have been used for any number of purposes, but the glory of this car is that they harness this power in the name of driving pleasure. Not just a few minutes of pleasure, but pleasure that lasts all day and, as it turns out, decades. The F1 came into existence at a critical turning point in the development of the automobile. Its primary rivals were all turbocharged and incorporated various technologies aimed at making the cars perform better, easier to live with, more efficient. The F1 proudly resisted that trend, one that has only escalated in the ensuing decades. This makes the F1 an absolute revelation today. It is a monument to driving purity that typifies old cars, yet the performance of the car is still extremely contemporary. New, they cost twice as much as the next nearest competitor, which kept sales low. Just 64 road cars were sold. Simply put, it's an incredibly singular experience. There is no car that gives you 80% of the feeling of this car for 10 or even 50% of the money. Any driving enthusiast who can afford it should buy one without even a moment of hesitation, not because they'll continue to appreciate, which they will, but because nothing else comes close.